Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'd like to welcome you all to, unfortunately, what is the third and final day of this incredible 2020 Women Leaders in Global Health Conference, and to this panel, Succeeding as a Woman in Academia, Battling a Pandemic and the Patriarchy. I'm delighted to know that there are around several thousand of you who've registered for this conference, and it's so wonderful to be able to come together at a time like this. As was mentioned by our opening speaker on day one, Ms. Barka Dutt, this is truly only the beginning, with conversations that need to be had and actions that desperately need to be taken to level the playing field for women in global health internationally. But to bring some light to this topic, I'm joined by a real powerhouse panel of speakers who really need no introduction, but I can think of few better individuals that not only talk the talk, but also walk the walk. First off, we have Professor Michele Berry. Michele Berry is the Drs. Ben and A. Jess Shenson Professor of Medicine and Tropical Diseases, who was elected to lead the board of directors for the Consortium of Universities for Global Health in 2019. She's the founder of the Stanford, Yale, Johnson & Johnson Global Health Scholars Program. She has sent more than 1,000 physicians overseas to underserved areas, and she is a past president of the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Dr. Berry is also an elected member of the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences. She's a passionate clinician and scholar. She has sent hundreds of students around the world to create innovative global health programs. And she has also sent over 2,000 physicians around the world to help strengthen health and educational capacities. Dr. Berry's scholarly interests include tropical medicine, global health ethics, and the impact of climate change on megacities. She served on the Obama Women's Health Subcommittee, is a member of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and sits on its Global Health Board. Dr. Berry is a recipient of both the Elizabeth Blackwell Medal for outstanding contributions to women in the field of medicine and the Ben Keane Medal for dedication to clinical tropical medicine and impact on the training of students, fellows, and practitioners. I also happen to know Professor Berry recently as a mentor, and we're honored to have her here. Professor Binagwaho is the Vice Chancellor and co-founder of the University of Global Health Equity, an initiative of partners in health. She's a Rwandan pediatrician who returned to Rwanda in the late 1990s and worked for 20 years in the public health sector, first as a clinician in public hospitals and onwards in her work with the ministry. Between 2002 to 2016, she worked in various high-level government positions, serving first as Executive Secretary of Rwanda's National AIDS Control Commission, then as Permanent Secretary, and lastly, as the Minister of Health for 5 years. Professor Binagwaho serves as Senior Advisor to the Director General of the WHO, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School, Adjunct Clinical Professor of Pediatrics at Dartmouth School of Medicine, and Professor of Pediatrics at UGHE. She's a member of the US National Academy of Medicine and a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. Professor Binagwaho has published over 190 peer-reviewed articles and was named among the 100 most influential African women for 2020. Again, she is a personal hero for her work in chronic non-communicable diseases, both on the continent and internationally. Professor Kang is a professor at Wellcome Trust Research Laboratory and the Division of GI Sciences at the Christian Medical College in Vellore. Dr. Kang has built a strong interdisciplinary research program for enteric infections and child health. Her work on enteric infections, nutrition, and cognition, which combines field and laboratory studies, has resulted in a better understanding of environmental enteropathy and its consequences. Her team has evaluated vaccines in preclinical and clinical phase 1 through 3 studies for rotavirus and cholera, and she's a member of many WHO advisory committees. She's the vice chair of the Board of Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovations and chairs the Immunization Technical Advisory Group for the WHO's Southeast Asia region. She's the only physician scientist to receive the Infosys Prize in Life Sciences and the first Indian woman to be elected to the Royal Society in the UK. I've had the pleasure of getting to know her as part of this panel. And last but not least, Professor Heidi Larson is an anthropologist and director of the Vaccine Confidence Project. She is a professor of anthropology, risk, and decision science in the Department of Infectious Disease Epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's a clinical professor in the Department of Global Health at the University of Washington in Seattle, and a guest professor at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. Dr. Larson previously headed global immunization communication at UNICEF, chaired Gavi's advocacy task force, and served on the WHO SAGE working group on vaccine hesitancy. Dr. Larson's research focus is on the analysis of social and political factors that can affect uptake of health interventions and influence policies. Her particular interest is on risk and rumor management from clinical trials to delivery. And she served on the FDA Medical Countermeasure Emergency Communication Working Group, currently as PI for a global study on acceptance of vaccination during pregnancy, and on an EU-funded project on deployment, acceptance, and compliance of an Ebola vaccine trial in Sierra Leone. Finally, she is on the global study on public sentiments and emotions around current and potential measures to contain and treat COVID-19. And I also had the chance to encounter her during my training at LSHTM. As for myself, I am on faculty in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the Yale University. We're going to launch right into the questions, and please feel free to share your questions in the chat group. We will funnel those in as appropriately. Thank you, ladies. So first off, in May, a group of female scientists co-authored an article titled, "Women in Science Are Battling Both COVID-19 and the Patriarchy," which states, "Lifelong battles for a place in science have left us unprepared for the gendered and racial inequalities we have experienced in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. There are well-documented and deep cultural and institutional structures that limit women's ability to rise in academia. Please walk us through successful advocacy for any change that you have seen in your work." And I will start with Professor Berry.
Thank you, Christine. And I congratulate and celebrate you as an inaugural WomenLift Health leader. And I think this question that you ask is really important for women to actually advocate around institutional change, around gender and racial inequalities. But I really think that the best way to do this is with collective voice. And when I mean collective voice, I'll give you an example. Early on in my career, where I spent most of my career at Yale, a group of us noticed that there were gender inequities in pay. In fact, I was at the same level as my husband, and my husband was even paid more than I, which was quite striking and disconcerting. And we developed a group of young women and senior women to actually write the first Bill of Rights for women in science and in medicine at Yale. At the time, we did hire a lawyer, although we didn't need a lawyer, because when we brought our petition and our Bill of Rights to the institutional leadership, they actually listened and then began to correct salaries and track demographics. They have a way to go still, but I think that's a good example of how collective voice, even if you're young, can work. The second way that I think is very strong mechanism to advocate around institutional change is through getting to that leadership position as a woman and really doing something. So I'll give you an example of Glenda Gray, one of my South African colleagues who became the head of South African Medical Research Council. And she noticed that basically all the large institutional grants were going, these are these 15-year grants where they actually give you 15 years of funding, were going to men. And what she decided is she went to all the institutions and said, we will not give you funding for these 15-year units unless you have a PI that's a woman. And basically, we will do this until we have gender parity. And lo and behold, I asked her for the most recent numbers before giving this comment. She said they've actually achieved gender parity. So there's an example of where leadership for a woman made a difference. And then the second example is another colleague of mine, Hannah Valentine, who became the chief of diversity at NIH, which is a very stodgy, well, I shouldn't say stodgy. It's a very successful institution in the US. And she noticed that all the chairs of all the intramural programs were all men, and that they were men really 15 to 20 years into their tenure, some even up to 30 years. And so she rocked the apple cart as a leader to actually limit term limits, well, to limit terms to 12 years. And I'm sure she was involved in the recent announcement by Francis Collins that he will not sit on any panel that is all mammals or all men. So I think that's my examples of how one can advocate for institutional change. And by the way, it's not only about gender, it's also about race and historically underprivileged institutions. So collective voice and leadership make a difference. Back to you, Christine.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Berry and Professor Binagwaho. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Oh, you're muted, Prof.
I forgot to unmute me. Sorry. I cannot agree more with what Michele said, that COVID, it's going to be an opportunity to push the change and the institutional change, because we all know that there are more women in global health than there are men. They are more on the front line, they die more, they have more hard time, and they are less in leadership position. So this is there are very little change since even this series of conference who had a big echo because it make people think, but the change are so slow. And also because in academia to fight for the woman to have the position, as Michele say, we need to pass through law, to regulation, and it's not easy. And we need somebody who take the cause, the problem in its hand and go and fight for it. They are very good men, but not so much, not enough that what we should have. And if we look at the data, the number of women in research, there is no place on earth where they do 50%. And even in South and West Asia, it's less than 90%. In Africa, it is sub-Saharan Africa is less than 32%. So there is a lot of way to go. There is very little progress, but we will not have that also if we don't have in parallel of academia political change. And when you see the position of women in leader position in the political arena that take decisions for where we have to go on the laws, etc., or the member of parliament, we have a long way to go. It's going to be a long fight. And in the meantime, the cost paid by to the pandemic, the women, the health workers on frontline are, most of them, women. And most of them neglected. We count when a doctor dies, but we hardly count when a nurse dies, and the majority of nurses are women.
Perfect, thank you so much. And we'll certainly come back to some of those points. I'll move to you, Professor Kang, next, please.
Thank you so much, Christine. You know, I think looking from a perspective in India, if I was to ask everybody on the panel and everybody in the audience if they know truly outstanding Indian women scientists, I think everybody's going to say, yes, we know somebody who comes from an Indian background and is an outstanding woman scientist. But I think it's very important to remember that India is a very stratified society. So while a small number of us might have risen to the top in India and outside, the bulk of our population continues to have challenges that go way beyond anything that we face. And we have it pretty bad as well. If you look at academia in India, even if you start out with people being at a reasonable level, there is attrition all the way up. But I'm much, much more worried about the hit that this pandemic and everything that is happening around the world will take on women who have to fight already to get out of the strata of society that they're from. The one thing you asked for positive examples, and I think in LMICs in particular, tracking metrics matters way more than it does in any other part of the world. So if you look at examples of what have been success stories in other parts of the world, one I can think of is the Athena Swan Awards. And I'm very pleased that in India, the Department of Science and Technology is looking at mirroring those awards, rewarding gender parity at the institutional level, because those are the only kinds of things that will make a difference. The government of India has all the rules in place for supporting women in science, but between having a rule in place and its application, there's usually a divide until you are measuring what the outcomes of those rules are. So we will see a few years from now how this is going to play out.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And Professor Larson?
Yes. Well, pardon me, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Anything to add, yes.
Well, I think that, I mean, one of the things I've really been thinking about is the importance also of starting at the consciousness about these things from a very young age. I mean, one of the things I really try to do is get young women conscious of I see my male younger researcher immediately get fluent on what they need to go to the next step already. I mean, they know the young women are not always thinking about moving ahead already in the same way. I see it's quite conscious. And one of the things I try to do is to encourage the young women to get fluent on what are the credentials they need, because I don't think we should be leveraging the equity on the basis of just it being equity. And I think that that's really important. We want to get there because of credentials. We want to get there because we deserve to be and are equally competitive, as it were, or competent. And I think it's important that we ground this shift, I think, around our credentials. And I try to get that engaged with women. We have different programs at the school. I mean, it was one of the things we featured in the Women Leaders meeting in 2018. There are, as we've heard, there are structural things you can do, but there are personal things you can do, pairing, the kind of mentoring group. But I think giving confidence is a really important thing too, to just, give that little push to some of your younger peers to kind of speak up, make space. But we've done, I think the most important thing I can think of in my own work is really getting my younger researchers much more conscious of where they need to be and to work toward that.
Wonderful. And I love that idea on empowering as well as mentorship. I'm going to turn back actually to Professor Berry, going along that line of mentorship. I know that you've been awarded, Professor Berry, the Elizabeth Blackburn Award for mentoring women in academic medicine in the US by the American Medical Women's Association. Can you describe what good academic mentorship involves?
All right, Christine, but I have to say, academic mentorship, it means more than being a mentor. It also means stretching oneself to also become an advocate. So what do I mean by this difference between mentor and advocate? So let me just briefly say, a mentor helps you navigate the water and basically brainstorms with you, not only about professional barriers, but also your personal barriers and roads to success. When you're a mentor, you try to help your mentee find clarity. And you do that by asking tough questions and doing really deep listening. So some of the questions might be, what are your core values? And do your core values actually align with your professional values? What makes you get up in the morning? And does that align with what you are doing? I think in the first speech this morning, we heard the 70-30 rule, that 70% of the time you should really want to go into work. And then you sit back with them and try to develop, well, what Heidi kind of talked about. You need the credentials and the skill sets to succeed. And then you talk about what are those academic, and I'm not going to say these don't exist, political barriers to succeeding in academia. And then I would strongly suggest that good mentors also talk about family issues. How do you take care of yourself? How does your family integrate into your career? What about your mental health and your personal space? So those are kind of some of the things that I think make a good mentor. And then I also say that you're not always going to be the right mentor for everybody. There has to be a good chemistry and also a good skill set, symbiosis. And a good mentor says, I can't be a good mentor to you, but don't close the door. You have to find that mentee another mentor that might be more suitable for that person. So that's mentorship. Then let me talk to you about the difference between being an advocate, and they don't necessarily have to be the same. An advocate is someone who actually nominates you, brings you to the table, puts you on task force, puts you on editorial boards, or gives you an editorial that they've been asked to do. And just to give you a little vignette, my first leadership job was as president of the American Society. Well, my big first leadership job was president of the American Society of Tropical Medicine. And basically I was nominated to run for this by one of my advocates. And I looked at him like he was nuts. I had just had a baby. I was breastfeeding. I certainly didn't think I had the qualifications. They never ever had a woman clinician in like 100 years of this society as actually the head. And he really pushed me out of my comfort space, and he made me run. And for some reason I was elected. But that's the difference between, and he was not my mentor. He was just someone who advocated for gender parity, and he was appalled that there weren't women. So that is my sort of shtick about what it means to be a good mentor, but you also need to find a good advocate. And they may not be the same, but really both are necessary. But having just one is really insufficient. You really need to look for both. I hope that answers you, Christine.
That's excellent. So mentorship and sponsorship or advocacy. And I actually want to turn back to Professor Larson just to build on that for our male colleagues and our male allies who we're so excited to have on the call also. So we've discussed many obstacles so far that women face. What advice, Professor Larson, would you give to male colleagues who want to be involved, who want to be mentors, advocates, and addressing some of these inequalities?
Well, I think that one thing is make space. And I mean that in literally a physical sense, making space at the table, but also, in conversations, in forums, and calling out women in a meeting to comment when they know that X, is very capable of making probably a very insightful and important comment, but is being a bit shy to speak up. Call them out, encourage men to, in a forum, there are a number of different ways to help initially speak up. I mean, at the end of the day, women need to speak up for themselves, but they need to get encouraged sometimes. I think another thing is in, as Michele was saying, recommending women. I also, one of the things I try to do, and I think my colleagues could do the same, when you get called by the media to speak on things, get your researchers trained up for public speaking, get them to, and have them, encouraged to speak up. We need more young women voices speaking about issues. So I think, they can help look for opportunities. They can spot talent also, and I think that should be encouraged. But I absolutely think that we can't make this shift without engaging men.
Wonderful. Professor Kang and Professor Binagwaho, I also want to pose that question on male colleagues to you because of the settings and cultures that you live and work in. Having been raised in Kenya for most of my life, I've also been privy to some of this. So please, if you could comment on that for our male colleagues, Professor Kang and then Professor Binagwaho.
Occasionally you get really lucky where you find people who just get it and who actually actively get out there and support women. I think a lot of the advancements that I had and a lot of the setbacks I had were determined by the kinds of people that I encountered. So I think if you think about positive role models, the kinds of people who do exactly what Michele and Heidi said, which is people who push you, people who make space for you, people who call on you, those are the kinds of people who really promote women. They tend to promote men as well, but I think the women notice and see it more. So how do we get more of those kinds of individuals? I think we have a responsibility when we ourselves are academics to make sure that when we train women and men, we work on the women to believe in themselves much more than they already do. And we work on the men to ensure that they turn out to be the kinds of academic leaders that we want them to be, that respect and support and promote women. So this can happen, but it does require all of us working together towards this.
Wonderful.
I can agree more. They have said almost all, is that we have to fight the bias we have been educated with, and the men have been educated with. There are many men who doesn't know that they are contributing to the gender inequities by their attitude or by the way, you trust somebody to do a task and you don't necessarily take the young woman who can do it when she should be the one to be exposed because she will learn. And but as a woman, we have to have that as something in front of all the decision we take. For the men, we are working, the university where I am, it's an African university with the name Equity. So a man who doesn't trust, who will discuss that, will be fired because or he will go himself because he will be mad. Gender equity is taught through all the courses in medical, in nursing, in masters, all. And those who doesn't cope with that or are uncomfortable with that are not staying. The other thing is to show where we are still not, we have not, still not reached the goal, we do an annual gender and diversity audit, passing through policies, habit, etc. And men are requested to be part of the exercise, and it's a rotation. So they are all exposed to the bias they have. And as Heidi said, we need to give room for the men to learn how to do it, but also to the women how to do it. And the most important is to give confidence. I totally agree. So our role in academic is also to teach the young women how to advocate for themselves, but also the men how to advocate for equity.
Excellent. And again, we're so grateful for organizations like WLGH that are providing this platform. I'm going to come back to you, Professor Binagwaho, on exactly what you've spoken about, which is your role as the Vice Chancellor for UGHE, where you actually lead this effort to train on equity, but more importantly, just speaking on systems and cultures you've used to explicitly support female students. And Professor Berry, I'm coming to you next with that question in your role in leadership at Stanford. What systems and culture?
So,
oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Agnes.
Oh, sorry.
No, you go first, hon.
Yes.
So what we do, I'm going to be brief. What we do, we make sure that we have 50% of each gender in the class. But for medical education, 70% of women. That is the bottom. Just because we want to give a message that it's the contrary that is done in other universities in Africa. The graduation average is 10% of female. So by creating this imbalance, we create discussion, and it comes every year. More scholarship for women because it's more hard, they are less supported by family. Discussion of all this, but openly, and having an internal in-house mentorship program to support women to find their place, because it's not always inside the institution that they have problems. Sometimes it's in family, because the dinner is late, or that day there is something they want to finish, and at home it's not understood like that. The role of the woman traditionally should be continued. So giving space and mentorship for all the problem, and ask men to do it, and have a public forum where we discuss this on monthly basis in the university is crucial for open mind. Wonderful.
Professor Berry, do you have anything to add? I wanted to just cite that UGHE is truly a unique institution in its nature, not just in Africa, but really internationally. Thanks so much. Professor Berry.
Yes, I would say Stanford is not quite there, Agnes, but we are working at trying to raise consciousness. And I think the best way, and one of the reasons why I actually had this crazy idea about starting WomenLift Health and having those conferences, is really to raise consciousness about men getting it, engaging men. I think in our first conference, it was mostly women that were speaking. And that was enhanced in the London conference, and certainly was equal in the Rwanda conference. So I think the more that we engage men in the conversation, the more that we have these leadership, and I have to say, global health is feminizing. About 80% of my students are women. So we need to do that extra mile to engage our male allies. And I think the way to do that is have these difficult conversations.
Great. Now I'm going to turn back to Professor Kang for the researcher's experience, and a very senior one at that. So Professor Kang, for you, in 2019, you became the first Indian woman to be elected as a fellow of the Royal Society in London. And so as a top scientist in India, you've spoken openly about gender-based discrimination you've experienced in the field. Can you please comment for us on how you've reacted to micro and macro aggressions, and how did you get to where you are today? And I'd like to pose that to Professor Larson after. So Professor Kang, please.
So it's a funny thing. So you get nominated, you get elected a fellow of the Royal Society, it blows up in the newspapers, everybody knows about it. It's a big deal. Then you go in to sit in a meeting, and I wind up chairing a meeting, which is all men. And the senior men are talking over me, as usual, because there is a topic, there is an agenda, we know what it is, it's very clear. And still you have these people 20 years older than me, very well recognized in their field. They're a member of the committee, they're not the chair. But when I say, please wait your turn politely, they don't, right? So I wound up banging the table and saying, I am the chair of this committee, and you will wait and speak when I tell you to. So if you look at that, microaggressions, all kinds of approaches that people take to ignore you, to pull you down, to dismiss you in some shape or form happen throughout everybody's careers. Women have it much worse than men do, because I don't think men deal with microaggression on the same scale. So really you have to think about, am I going to ignore it? Am I going to avoid it? Am I going to do something about it? Because I think if I avoid it, it exerts an emotional tax on me. And I think for the first 15 years of my career, I let that happen. I thought that was my place in the world. This was the way things needed to be. And there was very little I could do to change it. Then I had the experience, my entire education's been in India, and then I had the experience of going to the UK and the US for a year each. And suddenly it was like, oh, you're good. You know what you're talking about. You can hold your own here. And when I went back to India, I didn't want to be in the same position that I'd started off in. So I decided that if there was something that I didn't feel right to me, it was my responsibility to do something about it. So that's where I started to actually speak up. If something mattered and it bothered me, then I had to say something about it. And that's the way I've been now for the last 20 years. It's sometimes not gone so well, when I've become persona non grata for a while, when people have said, oh, she's an aggressive woman. But ultimately, you're standing on your science and you're standing on the clarity of your thoughts. So even if people push back, they do get it. And with the women that I have working with me now, I make sure that they understand that they have to continue to speak up. Otherwise, you are complicit in continuing a problem.
So, Cherry, it's really easy to speak up about microaggressions when you're a senior woman. I often get the question about how you can do that when you're junior and not sound strident or a troublemaker. And I would, there's a great article that one of my colleagues, Michele Mello, Mello, and wrote in the New England Journal about how to do this in a strategic way that's not offensive, to call out microaggressions even when you're younger. And it's a skill that I didn't have when I was younger. I was probably thought as very strident, and but it is a skill set. Do you have any, either of you, and Agnes, Heidi, or Cherry, have any suggestions on how to do this? Call it out when you're younger?
So the times when I have done that, I've usually done it not immediately, but after having gone away, come up with a strategy and decided how I wanted to approach this. And usually that was with finding an ally. who would speak with me. So it's not just I am this person who's out there who's yelling about a problem. It is people who have this problem, me and somebody else. So that sort of worked in some situations. Again, not always. And it does get a lot easier when you don't care as much and people can't impact your career as much.
That's what we need to teach the young women. Because most of the case, they will react aggressively because they are aggressed and they don't know how to turn this situation wisely and in a non-aggressive manner. So this is part of the advocacy we need to transmit. This type of attitude, because it will help them to progress in their work. And also it will help them to take it more softly, because it's destroying you when you have to fight every day. It depends of your nature. Me, I don't care to fight every day. But there are some people who will give up and go just because of that. So give them the skills to turn the situation. It's something very important that we should start thinking about curricula, an easy curricula for young people in academy, in health, in global health.
Professor Larson, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the point is, because I hate kind of fighting. I don't know, I just grew up in a different, I had a very German grandmother, so you just kind of, I didn't have an Indian context, but you just pull up your bootstraps and told to carry on, and I would rather kind of swallow it and just do my own thing in my own way without, but that's not necessarily the best way. And they say the patients who, don't speak up are the ones who are, have worse outcomes than the ones who might be more difficult patients, because they, get what they're, and I've kind of changed over the years, because I realized that was not the most productive way. But one of the big things that helped me in being able to call things out more is to feel like you don't have to come back to it with aggression. That's the part the space I didn't want to go into. I didn't want to be aggressive, but when thanks to some mentor friends, colleagues who said, you didn't have to put up with that. And I was like, and they said, you don't have to pick a fight. And that was the most important thing I heard. There are ways to do it without having to kick back. As both, I think everyone's made some comment on, there are ways to do it without kind of being aggression with aggression. I've learned a lot about this in my work with anti-vaccine people who can be incredibly aggressive. And it's finding a way to get your point through. In some ways, if you can do that, it gives you strength to deal with other things. But I also want to call out that one of my challenges has been that the kind of work I do has all male meeting environment is that is being a social scientist. It's already you've got the gender, so something that, I've had to change the way we've done our work to make it more quantitative, to make it more tangible, to make it, in the language of a discipline. But I think depending on where you are, and global health is a highly diverse field. So depending on the nature of your discipline within global health, some of that is going to be tougher for some than others.
All right, and thank you for that. Several really tangible solutions. So thanks for prodding that out, Professor Berry, including the idea of amplification, which I would like to also echo has worked as a junior faculty and finding allies that are amplifying for you. I'm going to turn to an audience question. I would like all of you to answer this question, and it's around the idea of pay equity, another area that needs tangible solutions. I'll just frame it in the form of this question from the audience. It says, the COVID-19 pandemic has hit female academics with school-age children especially hard in places where learning has shifted to online. This has resulted in fewer publications submitted by women. And then it goes on to say, this means that women's advancement and subsequent salaries will be delayed and forever behind her male colleagues, which is already an issue. What suggestions do you have for women, particularly in the COVID-19 context, with regards to navigating pay equity? And I'll just open it up.
Well, I can just say a few comments on what we're doing at Stanford. We recognize this, and we have a women's, again, this goes back to collective voice. We have a women's faculty forum that actually just put out a survey to see how much this is impacting women and in what directions this is impacting women, whether it be pay, whether it be childcare, whether it be elder care. It's not, some of the older faculty. So one is to get the data and then present the data to your institution. And then we actually asked for an opt-out, that we asked that everybody have a year delayed in tenure. And that only if you don't want it, you opt out, but everybody has to opt in. So that is some of the ways that we're trying to work at it. And also we're asking for subsidies in pay for women that need it.
Okay.
What Michele just said exemplify that the solution is institutional. It's not individual. It's not one woman who is stuck at home, who cannot do her academic work and take and delay plan achievement that can make the difference. But coming together and see what is wrong in the regulation of the institution will pay off. But this approach don't need to start with a COVID crisis, should be also the basis of the reflection of pregnancy, breastfeeding periods, and child care when we have a child sick, and it's the woman who is at task. And it's not only to share with the men at home, it's also to share with the entire institution. This should be recognized. We should treat like every woman who is pregnant like the future producer of a Nobel Prize. And she should be awarded like if she was doing mentorship, academic mentorship or something like that. This time should be protected, but also doesn't pull the woman back. COVID as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Professor Kang?
So if I can quickly comment on that, actually in India, most jobs in academia and in medicine, if you're not in the private sector, are salaried jobs. So for women, the question is, do you have the job or not? Not how much is the pay. Just as an example, my husband is a neurosurgeon. I'm a clinical microbiologist. I get paid more than him. But that's because I'm a year senior to him in college. So, in India, certainly in many settings like ours, it's really about there not being enough women in these kinds of professional positions rather than about jobs. In fact, I feel pretty sorry for American women. We get 6 months off as maternity leave, and it's paid and it does not affect your promotions.
So the answer is to move to India. I'm just kidding.
No, also organize.
We should just move policies from India in other place.
That's right.
Absolutely.
and organize and present it to your institution.
Right. Data.
Yeah.
Professor Larson, did you want to round that out? Any final thoughts?
No, I mean, I think they're all, I've just been shaking my head quietly here.
Fair enough. Okay, so I'm going to close with this theoretical style question from the audience. And again, this will go to everyone. It's this idea of the chicken and the egg. So they say it seems like universities try to push women to fit into their positions in hierarchical systems, rather than taking the time to consider changing the positions and systems themselves to include more flexibility and collaborations. I think we've kind of started to talk a little bit about this, but how can universities and systems be more, amenable for women researchers, in particular women in academia? What would this look like?
So if I can go with that, Christine, basically, I think speaking to what Michele said right at the beginning, if you get enough women in leadership, the structure of the job will change. So whenever I've led a group or led an institution, I have lots and lots of young women who get married, get pregnant, have babies, take time off, need to be away for childcare. But when their children are in school and they come back, they are way, way more productive than many of the men that I have. So if you take it over a time scale of an entire career, there is no question that women will be able to deliver. So if you are looking at women having a career that is truly productive, you have to make sure that you understand socio-cultural context as well as biology. When women lead, women will make sure that work job requirements account for that. What stage of life are they at? What age are they at? What are their aspirations? Over.
So I think we need, again, collective voice to actually advocate for family leave, extended family leave, for flex time, for on-site daycare, so that one can actually see your child or breastfeed during it. You need to have transition time to come back into the workplace. But I think that one way to do that is benchmark other institutions and put pressure on your institution. Institutions are very, they're looking at each other all the time. They want to be ranked. So there are subtle ways to pressure your institution into advocating for this.
If I can jump in, the question is interesting, but I don't see why we should take one or the other. We have to take both. And if there is a third way, we'll take it, because we need a change and all the avenues are good. When there will be more women in leadership position, change will be more easy. And if we wait to change the institution before pushing women to get in leadership position, I think our grandchild maybe will see it.
That's actually an excellent note to end on. We don't have to take one or the other. We're at a time, so but we should take both. I'm just going to close briefly that the time flew as we knew it would. We've heard a lot of really excellent things from these true exemplary women in research and advocacy and leadership. We heard about creating, uplifting, and mentoring and advocating. We heard when you get more women in leadership that the structure will change from Professor Kang. We heard make space from Professor Larson for our male allies. From Professor Berry, get the data. Data works to affect change. And again, in closing, from Professor Binagwaho, to do both. So with that, we will close. Thank you all for your time.